Welcome back to Normalized PTSD. Today we're going to chat with Sarah. Sarah is the founder of, I'm just going to spell it because it's one of those words, EQUUSOMA, specializing in horse to human trauma recovery. Today we're going to be discussing somatic experiencing because she does have a lot of experience in that. Find it pretty interesting topic and really enjoyed this chat. And hopefully you all find something beneficial in it.
We're with Sarah. Thank you so much for joining. If we could just get a little description of who you are, what you do, and go on from there. Thank you so much.
Certainly. Thanks so much. So I'm a registered psychotherapist in private practice in Canada, and I'm trained in a number of different trauma treatment approaches for humans. And also as a sideline, I also look at the intersection of equines and humans in terms of trauma recovery as well, both for the equine and for the human. But today, I think we're largely speaking about trauma recovery for humans in particular, and happy to get into a little bit more about some of those treatment modalities. And I think today we have chosen to speak about somatic experiencing of the many different things that I do. So I don't know if there's anything further you'd like me to share, Jonathan, about my background, but I'm happy to talk a little bit further if you think the viewers would like to know a little bit more.
Like we were just talking before we started, it's really interesting how you teach, I guess, um, other therapists on like a higher level of understanding on certain aspects, especially like equine and somatic experience. And I just think that that's really fascinating. And I was just curious to like, how many different levels are there, and like, how do you get that level of experience?
So if we think about somatic experiencing, so I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner, and I am also an approved provider of sessions and consultations for students in the SE training program. I'm not a faculty member of the SE Institute, but I can certainly speak about SE a little bit from the perspective in which I'm familiar with it.
Mm.
So SE training it's called a 3-year training. So what that essentially means is that there's 3 levels, and it's often taught with anywhere between 2 to 3 years. It's taught over a period of time because largely it's a method for trauma resolution that a lot of different people and lots of different scopes of practice take. And the reason why it's spread out over that period of time is so that the people learning the method are also working on their own trauma resolution in their own nervous system,
Hmm.
in order to be able to support that same resolution in the clients themselves, or a similar resolution. It might not be the same, but because everyone's a bit different. But we do that work specifically in order to be able to integrate the work and embody it on a deep level. I don't know if you can actually hear the snorts in the background. I've got 2 dogs, and one of them is in the room with me, and he's rolling himself on the carpet and making little snorty sounds. So
That's okay.
if ever you hear that noise on the background, that's who's here with me right now.
That's awesome.
Mhm.
Okay, so today we're going to dive into somatic experiencing, and I was just wondering if you just give us a brief description of, I guess like a dictionary description of what that is.
Sure. So, somatic experiencing is a really cool trauma resolution method that was the term was coined by Dr. Peter Levine, who sort of was the founder of the method. The method itself is based on a lot of different areas of knowledge and practice that he didn't necessarily originate. I mean, like many people who've created really incredible trauma resolution methods, the originator is obviously sitting on the shoulders of other folks as well, who've also contributed largely to the body of knowledge that has led to this. And so somatic experiencing is no exception. And somatic experiencing reflects like eons upon eons of understanding of how mammals resolve trauma in their own bodies. And it's a really fascinating method that looks at how animals under optimal conditions move through their threat or danger responses in their nervous systems. And if they go into freeze, they may freeze, but then come out the other side and discharge that excess survival activation that's left in their nervous systems, and come down and back to finding balance again after these various experiences are over. And animals throughout time have done this. And what's interesting is that animals in captivity, including human animals, and I would wager that human animals are a largely captive species if we were to think about the societal constraints that block us from having these full responses. We do see trauma more often in captive species, including humans. And so what does that look like, and how do we go about sort of returning to our mammalian birthright, so to speak? Because our nervous system is built to be able to restore balance.
Mhm.
And when that's not possible, we start to see um, trauma patterning, or trauma responses showing up in the nervous system that can impact relationships and behavior and learning and performance and health, in lots of different areas. And so how do we go about basically returning to, or helping the nervous system to reset in the way that it actually knows how to? And that would sort of be somatic experiencing's goal in a small nutshell. It's much more complex than that.
Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
So there's a couple of things that I thought were really fun when I was diving into this topic, and one is when you're talking about discharging energy. For like an example that I thought was really relatable was seeing a cat. Two cats get into a little scuffle, and then afterwards you see one of them shaking it off, and I was like, oh, okay, I can relate to that. I see cats do that, and that's like an example of like the discharge of energy. Uh, but I also was talking to a psychologist the other day,
Hmm.
and I started seeing how like there's all these are really connected, and you could see it with someone who's in shock. Someone who's in shock is, they tend to shake, and that could be another example of someone trying to discharge the overwhelming amount of energy. And I heard someone else talk about that energy is not always bad either. Like you hear stories about a mother who will pick up a car to save their child. That energy may break her bones, or tear muscle or whatever, but that energy still gives her enough strength to save her child. So I just thought all of that was pretty neat. How, like, there's pros and cons to the energy, and this is going to dive into more of that energy that gets stuck. And I feel like a lot of times it might get stuck because we're afraid of
Yes.
discharging it because it's uncomfortable in some our society now of doing things. And I was wondering if we could dive into that a little bit about this being a body-centered approach. And we it's not so much about the mind, because we're talking about the reptilian mind, the mind that you can't really talk to.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, both communicate to each other. And so
Right.
we use the entry point, which is often the sometimes we'll use the verbal story to get at the body story, but we don't stay with the verbal story. The goal is that we're working with the body's response that can't always easily be accessed by the verbal story. So it's almost like a paradox. We start there, but that's not ultimately where we're wanting to end.
Hmm.
It's this deeper thing. And you said something about shock that I didn't want to forget before we continue.
Okay.
So the shaking that occurs during shock can be a few different things. And so, like with any kind of response that the nervous system has, the answer is usually like, well, what does this mean? I'm like, well, it depends. Right. So is that shaking that we see that the person is having during shock, is that the discharge as they're coming out of the shock, or is that the freeze sort of fear response as they're entering into shock?
Hmm.
And so it's almost like, is it on the way up or is it on the way down?
Right.
Right. And so that shaking, the tremoring, we can actually see on the way up as something's trying to mobilize but can't, because it's not safe to fight or to flee. It's not possible to fight or to flee. And so we might see that shaking sort of out of that sense of fear, like I can't do anything, right? That very deep, pervasive sense of I'm all geared up and have nowhere to go. And so it can be representative of the high amount of charge that's sort of stuck out of the fear, or it's like the coming back out through the other side. It's like I'm coming through the immobility and I'm discharging, and it's kind of thawing, right?
Hmm.
So Are we entering into the shutdown, or are we coming out of the shutdown? And so this is where, like you're saying, it's a very body oriented approach. You can't talk your way out of this sort of experience. It's very
Right.
much a bodily felt sense experience. And this is very different from, say, okay, I want you to now go punch this punching bag, right? That would be sort of catharsis. And the goal of somatic experiencing, while at times may look cathartic, that's not the intention behind it. So we're not looking for just the simple venting, of a response. We're looking at completing and moving through all the nuanced bits and pieces that show up in response to something that was incomplete, as opposed to, well, I just want you now to go punch this punching bag,
Hmm.
right? That would be a very, very different goal and intention to what somatic experiencing is all about. And some people think, oh, well, that's all SE is. SE is just, well, you're just going to work through your fight response, or you're just going to work through your flight response. And it's not as simple as that. So yeah.
Uh, do you have, like, in your experience, do you have any examples of how you've seen people store energy? Like, is there visual indicators, or is it more of an emotional indicator?
All of the above.
Right.
So if you think about aspects of a person's experience, and this could be true potentially for animals, but we have to sort of infer this. But Peter Levine uses something called SIBAM. So SIBAM are these different elements of an individual's experience. So sensation is one,
Hmm.
and sensation would be like the body sensation. So like, I don't know, like a tremor, or heat, or buzzing, or smoothness, or like those kinds of things. Like,
Right.
I feel a buzzing in my chest, or I feel a radiating down my arm. Those would be body sensations.
Hmm.
Then there would be image or impression. So it's usually mental images, but can also be the felt sense impression of a sensory thing. So, like, I can still connect to the imprint of a sound, right? So there's the sound, and then there's my recall of that sound, and how I notice that. But usually, it's usually a mental image. There can be behaviors. So B is behavior for SIBAM, and that would be things like facial expression, gestures, movements, postures, actions, those sorts of things. And those can be both physical actions, but also personality or intellectual type actions,
Hmm.
like using humor as a coping mechanism. That would be a behavior, right? So
Right.
it's not always physical behavior. Sometimes it's more mental behavior, for instance. Um, and then there would be a affect, which is fancy clinical word meaning emotion.
Hmm.
And so emotion being the sort of emotional feelings, so joy, rage, sadness, that kind of idea.
Right.
And those are distinguished from sensations. So, for instance, if you have the emotion of joy, you might have the sensation of warmth in your chest, for instance. Right?
Right.
Um, so then, hold on, I'm just going to change
It's
rooms because my dogs have
it's
decided
all
to
right.
just. So a affect, so a feeling, an emotional feeling can have a physical sensation, right?
Hmm.
Like I feel sadness, and the sadness is showing up like as a heaviness in my chest, for instance, that kind of idea. And then there will be M, meaning making, which is the thoughts and beliefs that we may have in relation to a particular experience. And that would be more like what we think about as cognition, right?
Hmm.
So there's all these bits and pieces. And so we're working at multiple levels of the experience to try to figure out what's missing. So sometimes in a traumatic experience, there will be what we call overcoupling and undercoupling. So overcoupling would be when multiple aspects of SIBAM come together really quickly. Think of like classical conditioning, like whenever the dog hears the bell, it starts to salivate, right? So it's
Right.
kind of like, oh, whenever I approach this intersection, I always see red Mazdas, right?
Right.
And it's like, or blue trucks or what have you, right?
Hmm.
And so because I had an accident at that intersection and I was hit by a red Mazda or a blue truck, right? And so now whenever I'm at that intersection, I only ever notice that
Color.
vehicle,
Yeah.
right? That kind of vehicle there. So that would be like an example of overcoupling, like I'm overly attending to, or there's an over preponderance of this particular information,
Hmm.
mainly because I'm attending to that because I want to stay safe. But if there's overcoupling, there's also undercoupling, which is something that's missing that should be there, like where the green vans, for instance, when I get to that intersection, I never notice those, they're there too, right? And so
Hmm.
if there's overcoupling, that means there's always undercoupling. And when we're working with trauma response, usually what we start to see is that there's some bits and pieces that are missing and some bits and pieces that are overly there. And that almost, it's like a way that the brain tries to make sense of information. It's like something was too much, it was too overwhelming. And so I can't attend to all the information because it's too much to take in. And
Hmm.
so as we're working on growing the capacity or growing the window of tolerance, to use Dr. Dan Siegel's language, to actually work through that discharge, we have to work with all these little bits and pieces that are missing. So when you were saying, oh, like, are you working with this? And I go, yeah, well, like we're watching, like, what are we watching for? We're watching for the things that are present that are cueing us to let us know, hey, there may be an incomplete response here. And how do we
Right.
know? We know that by the presence or the absence of different CYBAM elements. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Whenever you talk about your ex-partner, I notice that your face goes flat and there's like no emotion.
Mhm.
Right. And
Right.
it's like, and the person talks about how this person harmed them and
Hmm.
how this person, breached boundaries. And they talk about it in this very passive, quiet way. And
Mm.
it's like, oh, I get really curious about what incomplete fight response there might be, right? Because there's information missing from
Right.
this picture, right? It's like, oh, that's so interesting. As you talk about them, I notice maybe there's maybe a finger starts to twitch,
Mhm.
right? And it's like, oh, so as you're speaking about your ex-partner, I noticed that your finger starts to twitch. I wonder what happens if we were to pay attention to your finger for a moment.
Mm.
And if we shift the attention from the verbal story to what the body is or isn't doing, and then we start to get curious about what might not be finished here.
Mm.
Right. And it's like, oh, that little finger twitch might be a tiny little segment of a larger sequence that wasn't possible to complete, right? That little twitch might actually be the start of a sequence moving towards creating a fist, moving towards wanting to throw a punch, but that wasn't safe to do because maybe the partner was really scary or maybe the partner was very violent, right? And it wasn't
Right.
possible to fight back. And this might actually be sitting on years upon years of childhood difficulty where it really wasn't possible to voice how I felt because my caregivers may have been violent or scary too, right? And
Right.
so I might have generations of learning of how to not, to hold back my fight response, for instance. And therefore that was a safe thing to do. It was not safe to express that, and so I'm not going to have access to that. But then what we start to see is difficulties in other relationships, difficulties in
Right.
other situations where that person um, wasn't able to mobilize a response when it was absolutely necessary. That aliveness that comes with the fight response is not wrong or bad, right? That aliveness is part of our life force, that agency that kicks in. That's really, really important. I'm just gonna I don't know if you're hearing the barking right now, Jonathan,
It's
uh,
okay.
but I'm
I
just
don't
feeling.
mind it, but yeah, I see the importance because it is.
I normally when I record podcasts, it's
Yeah.
super chill and the dogs are super quiet, but
No,
there's
it's okay. I
the
love
time
dogs,
we've
so
got
it
deer.
does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've got deer right now, and so the deer are moving through the yard, and they tend to like see the deer and bark profusely.
Yes.
So if you just don't mind just one moment, I'm going to see if I can address that because
Okay.
finding it hard to focus. So just
Yep.
give me one moment.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks for that.
Oh, no worries. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's hard. Yeah, I get that you appreciate dogs, and for me, like the sensory input is really distracting, so it makes it hard for me to
Yeah.
focus.
I have
Um,
to do that. I was on a call with, I think, my mother, and I had like the little ones, like my niece and nephew were there, and it was just so much background noise, and it's like hard for me to think.
right. Yeah, it makes it really difficult. And what's interesting with trauma is kind of similar, right? Where certain bits of sensory input become almost like a loudspeaker.
Yeah.
And so certain things start to take over, and it makes it very, very difficult to not attend to anything else. Now, in this case, for me, it's not so much a trauma response, but more about, hold on, I'm still having to catch my breath because I had to run upstairs. um, Not so much a trauma response, but more about like sensory processing stuff.
Hmm.
So being neurodivergent, it makes it a little bit more difficult for me to kind of tune out certain bits of information. So, but that can also be true of trauma. And so it's interesting what we start to see. So part of it is like, how are we listening to the body by following these 5 different pathways of information, among other things, to,
Hmm.
to see what's wanting to complete, what wasn't possible to complete because it wasn't safe to, or it wasn't possible, or the conditions of the situation just prevented it, either because of social norms or occupational rules, or or fear of judgment or
Hmm.
danger, meant that these responses were not possible to act on. And then that gets sort of stuck in the nervous system, and our personality shapes around that, and our relationships end up shaping around that, and our patterning in various contexts starts to shape around these things that just didn't get to happen. And so it becomes really fascinating to work with the body as it starts to move through and complete these responses. And then what's different for an organism as a result of that completion.
Yeah. It sounds like there's visual and emotional cues of
Mm-hmm.
subconscious, and like you kind of, it seems like you as a therapist would like pick up on those to identify things that may have not been processed at a deeper level, and I feel like that's pretty interesting concept. uh so SE, is that like a specific, is it its own practice,
Yeah.
or is SE like a larger umbrella with smaller, or like with like, I guess, more specific therapeutic practice or practices beneath it?
So that's an interesting question. So somatic experiencing is its own methodology.
Uh-huh.
Um, Now there are other trauma resolution approaches, I suppose you could say, that also borrow from the same understanding. Like I would say SE
Mhm.
is perhaps not unique in this idea of supporting um, this understanding of mammalian fight, flight, freeze responses and other sort of self-protective actions that mammals take, including sort of relationship, and using relationship either as a source of safety and protection, or using relationship to try to appease danger.
Mhm.
Um, but there's other certainly approaches that use this as well. That would be beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. But then within somatic experiencing, there are a lot of offshoot approaches that were developed by different faculty members and different community members that are almost like evolutions of the method,
Mhm.
that where the method itself is sort of foundational, but then they've built on that to add in things, or look at things from a different angle. So I would say that there's somatic experiencing as like the large umbrella as its own standalone method. And then from there, there have been offshoots that have been created, that have evolved out of that. And so I think that's true of a lot of things. I think of EMDR and brain spotting and other sort of trauma resolution methods that may be a little bit more well known. And that's certainly true there as well, where there's been offshoots or developments that have occurred that have where the protocol has been changed slightly, or there's been an adaptation, and that adaptation turns into its own thing. So I would say that's certainly true.
Okay.
Mhm.
Because I couldn't find a clear answer when it came to like craniosacral, rolfing, things of that nature. And I was just like, I don't know, is that part of SE, or is it
No,
like,
separate. No, Rolfing precedes SE. Craniosacral, I don't remember when that came on online as a method. A number of things sort of evolved out of the same time period. A lot of mind body stuff emerged out of the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a period of time even earlier than that, where some body oriented methods started to make themselves more well known. And so I would say SC falls in that tradition, but Rolfing is very separate. So Rolfing is a body work technique that I think works a little bit with myofascial release, but not exclusively so. It's structural as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so Rolfing looks a lot at structure and how development, and I think even early trauma can impact your posture and your structure. And SC would actually dovetail really nicely with something like Rolfing, or other bodywork methods. Like I think SC is probably in some ways the touch component of SC is probably closer to craniosacral
Right.
than it is to Rolfing.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the quiet holding that we do in somatic experiencing with the touch work. It's not a body work method. So somatic experiencing does have touch work, but touch work is not the same as body work. And what I mean by body work is something more like Rolfing or massage or physiotherapy or chiropractics, that sort of thing, where there's actual manipulation of tissue,
Right.
or manipulation of joints. And that's very, very different in intention than the touch work that we do in somatic experiencing. So that would probably put it closer to craniosacral, but they're not the
Mm-hmm.
same thing.
Okay. Yeah,
Mhm,
this whole world is very new to me. I'm very traditional,
mhm.
uh, like path. Like, you know, I had a couple of people on and they've mentioned some of this stuff, so it's made me curious about it, and that's why I'm diving a little bit deeper into it as well as I we'll get to it. I don't know how to find someone who's good at SE. You know, I don't even know what that means. You know, like I'll be looking into it here for the Big Island of Hawaii because I would like to experience just to see the benefits of it, because there's a lot of things that you speak to as well as some of the videos have talked to that I definitely see in myself, so it's something that's got me curious.
It's a really fascinating method, and it has been used a fair amount with, I think we were talking earlier about the importance of this for military veterans, and active duty service, um, folks who are in the military or first responders. I think of policing or paramedics, that kind of thing, dispatch, firefighting. And so the SC has been used very extensively with these populations, in large part because of how the nervous system is impacted by these forms of careers. Not just as in the career itself impacts the nervous system, both through the training and through the exposure of the experiences encountered in the course of the career, but also for the folks who end up often self-selecting into these careers, often have
Hmm.
a history that sort um, of difficulty that may precede entering those careers that already shows certain patterning. So in Hawaii, certainly, afterwards, I'm happy to point out to you, the directory, and perhaps point in the direction of some names of some folks if you're there for a while,
Yeah,
who might be of
absolutely.
interest. Yeah, for sure. The SCI directory, there's two directories on the SCI website. One is their main practitioner directory, and then they have another practitioner directory, which is for the folks who have been assisting, for somatic experiencing trainings for some time, who are now approved providers for students in the program. So the main directory, you'll get a wide range of folks. And then the sort of subdirectory is folks who are even more specialized, who are supporting students who have been through the training multiple times, and have integrated it on a deeper level. So there's a couple places where you can go looking, for information for folks if that's of interest to you,
Yeah,
especially if you
absolutely.
have a military connection. I think it would be of particular interest.
Sweet. Yeah. Anything referenced, whether it be in emails after this or even during our chat, I'll throw it in the show notes at the bottom with a link so it's easily accessible to whoever wants to go find it.
Sounds good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's really, really great information out there. And it can be very nuanced work. People often think that, oh, well, you're focusing on this release stuff. And it's like, well, yes and no. Like, yeah, while we're wanting to support the nervous system to discharge sort of the excess that's stuck in the nervous system as a result
Mhm.
of various experiences, it doesn't always look like that. People will often point to that very famous video of the polar bear, after it was sedated by dart gun by a bunch of scientists, and showing that polar bear moving through the immobility response and doing that sort
Mhm.
of tremor shaking. You can see the completion in the legs, you can see the fight response in the teeth, you can see the completion of those fight or flight responses, and how the polar bear is discharging following that experience. But it doesn't always look like that. Sometimes the response and the work, it's much more painstaking, and it's about growing
Mhm.
the capacity to be with tiny, tiny amounts of something, because to be with more of that is terrifying. I had to shut this down a long time ago. I wasn't allowed to face these things. And so there's layers and layers of managing and protecting around allowing these responses through, because the captivity conditions, so to speak, if I may use that term, have made it such that it wasn't safe to allow that. And so it's not always as simple as, well, let's just let you shake it out.
Right.
It's not always like that. I mean, sometimes it takes months of work before that even shows up, and it doesn't mean that we're not doing work. It's just that we're having to work really carefully with a nervous system and a personality that have been shaped around this idea that moving through these things was not okay, for whatever reason. And so people will say, well, I don't even know how to be in my body. I don't think somatic experiencing is for me. And I would go, that you would be probably a really good candidate for it, because the whole point of
Mhm.
SE is to help you grow that capacity. We don't just throw you in the deep end right away. Right. And so people often think that it's not the right approach because they can't be in their bodies. And I would go, that would be exactly the reason. you know and because we do something called titration, we do these little tiny tiny dips into it to help build the capacity, and then we
Mhm.
work with the fear that's associated with that, so that we uncouple that fear from being in that response, and that grows the window. And it's done in such a tiny tiny finessed way, that it's not about overwhelm or flooding the nervous system. That would be a trauma, a repeat of a traumatic experience would be to reflood the person,
Right.
right?
I saw it described in the video. It was pretty neat. It was I think it was Peter Levine.
Mhm.
And he was just talking about how, if you get this acid and this base and you just pour them together, it causes a massive explosion.
Yeah,
And it's like, and instead of that, like what we tend to do is just drip it on top of each other, and it
yeah.
slowly divides it into water and salt. And I was like, oh, because like you said, if you were just dive all into it again, then it's basically just going to re-traumatize you.
Totally. That would be the antithesis of what we're trying to aim for, right? We
Right.
want to support something different to happen. Peter Levine calls it renegotiation as opposed to reenactment, right? A reenactment would be following the same sequence over again into the same result. And then it's like, and then people go, well, see, I don't want to do this because it always leads me here. And I would go, exactly. So that's what we don't want to be doing, right? We don't want to be repeating the same thing over again so that you wind up in the same place every time. We would like to renegotiate, which is where we're carefully moving through the bits and pieces until something shifts and is different as a result. So if you go into, say, a particular sensation, and every time you go into that sensation, you then go, oh, this is going to overwhelm me and I can't tolerate this, and now I'm going to shut that right down and avoid the topic altogether, then it's like, okay, we need to go smaller, right? We need to start way further back, than just going right for the center of that. We want to kind of start at the periphery and move in,
Right.
and that takes a little bit longer, but that's the way to get there.
And I'm
So,
sorry, I keep saying Peter Levine, or what is it, Levine? I just keep thinking of Adam Levine, the
yeah,
singer. And
yeah.
I'm just like, oh, I can't get it out of my head. It's
Who's the
almost like
singer?
equine and equine, because when I think of equal and
Right.
like equate, and it's just like, Jonathan, stop it.
Well, that's funny because I always thought it was Adam Levine. I thought that Maroon 5 singer. I thought it was Adam Levine, not Adam Levine. So now I'm
See,
confused.
it may be. I'm from the South, and it's like we've pronounced everything wrong my whole life. So I don't know how to say any of it mostly. And then you sprinkle some TBI in there, and it's just like all kinds of confused. And I'm like,
Oh,
hey, you know
for sure.
what? Yeah, I'm just over here with crayons trying to figure it out.
Yep. Well, and
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
Nope,
Yeah.
all good. I was next question was going to be how might SE be helpful and how can it modify our stress responses?
Right. So, um, gosh, I'm trying to think about how to distill this down in a short way.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, like how do you take something that
I
can
know
be
that's a
difficult
deep
to
question with like and has offshoots every direction.
It
Yeah, something
does.
simple.
It does, because SE looks different depending on the nervous system that you're working with. Like
Right.
there are some things that are similar, because a nervous system's a nervous system, but everyone has different experiences and different contexts and different like adversities that they've faced and different
Hmm.
intergenerational patterns and different sort of social contexts that they have to navigate. And so it's very complicated to say, oh, SE looks like this.
Right.
Here's how it's helpful.
Uh,
Um,
Maybe
you know,
just like the most, I guess, recent example, like one or two examples of what you saw to like
okay,
put it in contextual, like,
yeah. So okay, so yes. I have permission to share this example, so I'll give you this example as one that makes sense to me. So, and maybe it's a good succinct one that would work.
mhm,
So, friend of mine was riding her horse a number of months back and had a fall.
mm,
And so, grand scheme of things, we would consider this like a physical shock trauma, right? Like it's so a little different from like chronic emotional abuse, for instance, that kind of thing, which was more sort of um, complex trauma, we might say, right? So a shock
mhm,
trauma is sort of like a single incident sort of moment, right? So here's a very simple example, perhaps. So person has this fall off their horse, um, and took their time getting back on, but they didn't really have the opportunity to go through the release or the renegotiation of the fall because there was other riders there and they wanted to keep going. And so while they did give my friend some time to work through the fall a little bit, my friend kind of did some stretches and took some time getting back up, but they didn't really have a chance to move through the discharge in the traditional way. They kind of were more mindful. They took their time, but they did get back up and get going again eventually. And so what was interesting is that in the months or the weeks following that experience, they noticed that they were more anxious around their horse, and their horse was less likely to want to be caught, and the horse wasn't as sort of comfortable out on the trails. And so there was this weird sense of, hey, I wonder what's going on here. And I was like, I wonder if this is, part of what's going on is the incomplete, like the lack of resolution of the trauma experience, because you're now feeling anxious, and this is an experienced horse person. This person's been around horses for a very long time,
mhm,
very comfortable, but was noticing more anxiety. And the horse was also being a little bit more evasive than usual.
mm,
And I go, okay, well, how much of this is now what's in the shared field between the two of you? Like there's now this experience, and now you're activated, and now the horse is activated, and we've got this common experience happening. And so what was really interesting was a number of months later, we had a chance to work through some of that because my friend is also a colleague of mine. And so she agreed to be a demo in a training I was giving. And so as we were working with tracking what was happening in the nervous system, it was so fascinating because we weren't even working with that particular event. We were just demonstrating what it means to track sensations. Like it was
mhm,
very, very simple sort of thing. And as we were doing that, as we were noticing the sensations, and we were connecting with sensations about what was a resource for her, as we connected to that, what was so fascinating was that there was starting to be some activation started to show up in her nervous system. And as we were tracking during this sort of demonstration, she started to notice sort of activation showing up in her hands, and she started to have much more sort of quick movements, quick responses. Something was building very quickly. And as that was happening, it was so fascinating. It was like, so if we slow this down, and we slow that movement down a little bit. What do you notice happens next? And she has a lot of good skills. Like she's also trained in somatic experiencing, so this
Hmm.
wasn't unfamiliar for her. And so it was really cool because as we were tracking, the image showed up. So Cybam, right? So this image showed up of her on her horse, and her hands gripped as if she was grabbing the reins.
Hmm.
And it was like what wanted to happen that couldn't, because the fall happened so quickly. Something I
Hmm.
think startled the horse. I forget the exact story, but ultimately the details are not so important because the body is working through the response. So she had the image in her head of what was about to happen, and it was like, so what's your body wanting to do? Like what is it wanting to do that it couldn't at the time? So it's not always just incomplete fight or flight, it's the incomplete self-protective response. So in her case, it was she wanted to grab the reins and be able to whoa the horse down, to slow the horse down so that the horse was able to come to a stop and she could dismount safely. That's what didn't get to happen. And what was so fascinating was as she was tracking the anxiety response that sort of showed up, the sensations rose in her chest and they moved through her arms, and her hands created they gripped the imaginary
Hmm.
reins that weren't there, but they knew to do the thing. And so the
Right.
movement that didn't get to happen at the time got to actually complete itself. Like this isn't voluntary. This is all completely involuntary. And so she grabs the reins and pulls them in, and you could see her head turn a little bit, like as if it was wanting to look in a particular direction that it couldn't
Hmm.
do at the time because it happened so quickly. And then as that sort of settled, like it kind of, the discharge was sort of like the tingling down the arms, after having grabbed the reins, so there was this action that got to mobilize that didn't get to happen at the time. And what was fascinating was afterwards there was this real sense of expansion and the anxiety was gone. And then I think what she was telling me is that her next ride afterwards was completely different. um and
Yeah,
for her and the horse, and it was
positive. Yeah.
right, like a completely different thing. And so like this is just a tiny example, but what
Hmm.
can happen when you work through what was incomplete. And the cool thing was is that I had no idea what was incomplete from that experience. I didn't even know we were going to head into that. We were just working on demonstrating to students how to track sensations, and track their various Cybam elements, and it showed up. And what was so cool about it was the movement through the completion of the incomplete response, which was in part the reins and in part like her legs. Also, I think there was something about her legs, wanting to grip. And then this a little bit of a looking response, a little bit of an orienting that didn't get to happen. It was like that moved through, like that action sequence completed. And then it was like, oh, that's no longer in the system anymore. Like she no longer has that holding up space, or it's no longer in the queue, so to speak. And so then it's like the anxiety is gone because I was able to turn and look. I was able to whoa the horse. I was able to do the movement that was built up in her system that was
Hmm.
creating this anxiety, right? And so that anxiety has got a chance to get, so quote unquote, resolved, you
Right.
know right? So that's just like a tiny example. It doesn't always look like that, but that's, I guess, one example that demonstrates the potential power of this idea of completing something that's incomplete, that's sort of still stuck in the queue.
It's interesting.
Mhm.
I just was thinking it's pretty neat how the body or is constantly trying to give us cues that something deeper is wrong. And I know from my personal experience, it took me a long time to ever get to the stage where I was able to look inward and
Mhm.
identify those subtle cues like, hey, hey, something's going on over here. You need to address this. I just, do you have any like tips, pointers that may help someone be a little bit more introspective?
It's interesting. The first thing would be, I would say, see if it's something you can be curious about. Like, because the idea
Okay.
is remaining curious about what it is that we don't normally notice. And part of this is being curious about something that you might not know what it means just yet. We're such meaning making creatures, and I think this is
Hmm.
one of the difficulties that we have compared to other species, is that we're always like, well, what does that mean, and then we go up into our heads, and then we're not able to be with the response itself. And I think because largely humans, I think I would say westernized humans perhaps, who we've all sort of to a certain degree learned to override our responses. We've learned how to override by just being in regular Western academia, going to school. It's like, no, you don't have to go to the bathroom right now. No, no, you're not hungry now. It's not snack time. No, you sit there, you need to sit there quietly, stop moving. Right. And so we've learned to override our responses, stop feeling that way, get over it, I'll give you something to cry about, right? Like there's all these things. And
Mm-hmm.
so as a result of that, we've learned to largely not pay attention, because what was the point? If you can't act on a particular impulse that's telling you something, then you learn to just ignore that thing. And that comes at a cost. And so part of it starts to become, can I be curious about the thing that I may have learned to disregard, and for various reasons? And then can I be curious about the fact that maybe I'm a little anxious about noticing the thing that I've learned to disregard, you
Mm-hmm.
know because it's like, well, I don't want to get overwhelmed. When I was little, that was really overwhelming. And it's almost like there's this expectation that it's going to be just as overwhelming as when we were small, although we have a much larger body and a much bigger nervous system now. The relational experience is that, oh, well, if I dip into this, I'm going to get overwhelmed like I was when I was smaller,
Mm-hmm.
when I had a much smaller body and less capacity. So it's like, can we be curious about the thing, and then what happens before the thing, and what happens
Right.
before the thing? And can we start to notice the sequences that tend to play out, and not just from this top down sort of, I get to be like a super sleuth and super like a detective, a body detective, and get curious there, but it's also about the bottom up process. So there can be noticing in a top down way, and there can be noticing in a bottom up way. And what we're looking for here is, I guess, a marriage of the two. you know it's like, oh, that's so interesting. Like, I noticed that as I'm talking to you, my jaw is clenching. I'm making this up, Jonathan, obviously, but like, like I'm noticing
About to
that.
say, I'm so sorry.
uh, but but like, it would be like just being curious about that, or like, but this obviously gets tricky. And this is one of the things we tell people is, um, somatic experience, like any other method that you decide to pursue, whatever that
Mm-hmm.
method is, um, can create changes in your life that may be uncomfortable, right?
Right.
So for instance, if so that may so for instance, if you are, say, in a relationship, or in a career that requires you to suppress or override, and you get to a point where you're burned out, because this is often what we end up seeing is people
Mm-hmm.
who hit a limit, right? They get to the point where they can't keep doing things the way that they've always done, and then they show up and they go, I've been doing this for decades, and it's not working anymore, and I'm now on a medical leave of absence because I'm burned out. And what's really happening is that their nervous system is so tired of having all this pent up energy and all this overriding to try to do their career or to try to be in a particular relationship, and then they can't anymore. And then they come because they want to be able to like somehow get better at managing and go back to being able to manage. And it's like, well, um, I I can't teach you. I'm not going to be the one to teach you to keep overriding. Like, I don't know how to do that. If you're already burned out from overriding, I don't know how to teach you to do more overriding,
Right.
right? And so for me, it's like, okay, so part of it becomes learning how to grieve, the fact that this is no longer possible. This
Mm-hmm.
way of doing things for so long served that person for a very long time and is no longer sustainable, because it requires using physiological states that are only meant for short-term use. I mean, if we think of
Yeah.
people who live in hyper arousal all the time, or who live in hypo arousal shutdown all the time, those are meant for short-term use. That's why animals in the wild, not that they don't experience trauma, they can, but it's not as common. And often what you'll see is acute stress responses, and then that goes away because the experience was short-lived, right? Like they
Mm-hmm.
mobilized their response, they did fight or flight or some sort of self-protective response, and it worked. right? Or they went into shutdown because that wasn't possible, but somehow the predator went away and they got to thaw out of the shutdown and move
Mm-hmm.
through all that fight or flight response and run off and go back to peaceful existence, right? So in the
Right.
wild, these stressors are short term, right? We mobilize, we shut down if we can't mobilize effectively, and we thaw and come out the other side. And then Bob's your uncle, we're done, right? It's relatively simple. We fight off the predator or we kill the predator and we're successful and we go on living, right? There isn't like, oh, well, you defended yourself against your attacker. We're going to put you in jail because you assaulted the person who attacked you.
Mm-hmm.
So messed up. Like we're so bizarre as a species, you know, we've
Yeah.
got responses that are there to keep us safe that we can get in trouble for using. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, that's weird. When did that start to happen? You know?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like animals in the wild don't walk around with ulcers chronically or PTSD chronically because they move through their responses and then it's done, you know? And that's the way that the nervous system is meant to function. It's like these are short term bursts and then they resolve. And or we die trying, right? Like then it's like it
Right.
wasn't successful, but then it ends, right? And us in captivity, it's like, well, it doesn't end. We're mobilizing, we're living in hyper arousal or hypo arousal, we're living in fight or flight or shutdown chronically. And it
Mm-hmm.
gets to that's not sustainable physiology. Like that is not a sustainable state for the nervous system to be in long term. And so people come and they go, hey, I need help. And it's like, cool, let's start to listen to what your body is saying. Let's start to help your nervous system and let's work through whatever needs to be worked through. But what that usually means is that you can't really go back to the prior way. You know, that burnout living in hyper or hypo all the time isn't sustainable because it's
Mm-hmm.
resulting in health issues and relational problems and career issues. And that does require a certain amount of grieving and dealing with the logistics of, well, now what does this mean for my life? So it's not that we don't ever work with the meaning making. Like somatic experiencing is very much a bottom up approach, working with the body, but then there's the very real logistics of, okay, well, what does this mean now for the marriage that you've been in that's been abusive for the last 30 years, right? Like,
Right.
how do we now deal with that? You know, because as the person starts to mobilize or feel safe, now they've got a dilemma on their hands. How do I feel safe being my full self in the context of this relationship where I'm not safe to be myself?
Right.
And there's a tough decision to make there. Or now that I start to work through my responses, and I start to come out of maybe shutdown or freeze or collapse, and I start to feel my own feelings again and start to find agency. I don't know if this career is the right fit for me anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, so it starts to become um, tricky, and so, and then that's part of the work too. Is then how do we navigate that? You know. Um,
Right. I feel like
Mhm.
a lot of trauma, especially when it's been suppressed for a long time and you get into uncomfortable or unhealthy habits, like that can breed into an unhealthy culture for your life. And then once you become aware of that, you're like, oh, wow. And then
Mhm.
that's like a whole nother process.
There's a lot of layers to this, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of layers. There's a reason why Pierre Janet in the 1800s, and then sort of repeated by Judith Herman in the 1990s, talked about like a triphasic model of trauma recovery, right? Where we start with state safety and stabilization
Mm-hmm.
largely, more or less, and then we move into like what we might call trauma processing, like working with past incidents and unresolved things, you know, that sort of thing. And that's usually called remembrance and mourning, and that looks different depending on the therapeutic approach. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's going to be like, I forget what the third step is called, but I usually refer to it as like the post-traumatic growth. Like, where do you go from there? You know, like basically you've been doing your work, you're largely, and you might cycle back and forth through these three stages, but
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, usually that stage three trauma treatment is usually like, you know, okay, where do we go from here? How do I now build a new life with this sort of post-trauma identity, you know, and what does that look like? And where are the gifts in that? And where's the growth in that? And what does that look like? And that can be the grieving that can show up in phase two work, obviously, but that can also show up in phase three is like the grieving of the previous life or what's no longer possible in order to embrace what's now possible, right? And
Mm-hmm.
what's different now, right?
Right.
Um, so that can take some time. Mhm.
So if I was going to do an SE session, What would it be like? Like my first one, never done it before in my life. Like, how does that go?
If it's somebody who has never done it before in their lives, usually what we would often dip into is getting a feel for or getting a read for that person's capacity. What can
Mm-hmm.
you sit with? And by which I mean, what do you have containment for? Now, containment doesn't mean containing doesn't mean suppressing, right? So what we're talking about containment is almost like, think of it like a soup bowl, like, and how big is your soup bowl and how much soup can you contain without it going over the edges and burning your lap, right?
Right.
Essentially, right? So like, and some people have a small container for certain things and a larger container for other things. And so part of, I would say, the initial getting to know a new client would be getting a read of their container, right? Is like, oh, what is it that you tend to be connected to? Because people
Mm-hmm.
come in with a lot of strength, right? And they come in with a lot of coping mechanisms, or what we might call management strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And they have found ways of surviving in their respective worlds. And so we get a read for that. It's like, okay, what has helped you to survive? And that can be personality or temperament based sort of patterning. That can be, what of SIBAM they're aware of or not aware of. Some people are really solid at meaning making and not at all aware of sensation,
Mm-hmm.
or they've got really good emotional literacy. They can talk about their feelings, but again, not super aware of their body, right? And so we get a read in those first appointments a little bit about what it is that the person has access to and what is not so much on the radar. And that sort of gives us a starting point because, like you said, we want to titrate in. We don't want to flood or overwhelm,
Right.
right? And the goal is to grow the capacity to be with these higher thresholds of what is sort of locked in the nervous system, but it can take a little bit to get there. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and some people have wider capacity in certain areas than others. And so we're sort of gauging that through getting to know the person. And it's not just the capacity for what we might call the trauma vortex, right? The trauma vortex is the activation, the unresolved things, all that kind of stuff. The fear, the pain, all those things, that would be sort of trauma vortex.
Mm-hmm.
But we're also gauging the person's capacity in terms of what Peter Levine calls the counter vortex, or some people call that the healing vortex. Like, how much capacity do you have in terms of being connected to that which is life affirming or life enhancing? Your own aliveness, in not just the aliveness of the, say, the fight response, because there's a really
Mm-hmm.
powerful aliveness there. That's really powerful stuff. But also aliveness in terms of joy, or excitement, or play, or pleasure, like the things that are nourishing. What capacity do you have to hang out in that, or hang out in calm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're gauging capacity in both directions, and then from there going, okay, cool, here's where we're going to start to grow, and grow the capacity both for the goodness, because
Mm-hmm.
the more capacity we have for the goodness, the more capacity we're going to have to be in the trauma vortex to work through those completions of responses. And so a lot of it might look like getting to know the person, like, what, and it might look like depending on the person you see, like how someone does SE will be determined by their scope of practice. So how a
Right.
body worker, like a massage therapist, does SE will look different in some ways to how myself as a psychotherapist does SE, right? So I will still do a history taking, for instance, but the history taking will be informed by SE. I'll be watching for what things is the person sharing or not sharing. How are they sharing it? What are they connected to as they share it? And we'll be titrating as well. If it becomes too much, do we back out? I'm watching for their responses in the room. Are they, when they orient to the space that we're in as we hang out together, do they pick a particular chair? Are they aware of their surroundings or not?
Mm-hmm.
As they look around their surroundings, are they in hypervigilance or hypovigilance? Are they no, or are they able to be in curiosity? Where are they in relation to me? Do they make eye contact, no eye contact, partial eye contact? You know, if I ask certain questions, what are they answering, what are they not answering, how, right? All that stuff is
Mm-hmm.
stuff that is giving me information about, okay, what might be overwhelming, what's been blocked, what's been, what is being managed,
Right.
and And it gives me good information around, okay, cool, this is how this nervous system has coped in order to survive in their various circumstances. And that's brilliant, you know. I'm not here to dismantle that, not in the way that you might think. We're there to work with it, you know, but when I'm not there to kind of go, oh, I see you doing this thing, stop doing that thing. I mean, that's
Right.
not how it goes, right? And so you may have seen a few videos of Peter working with Ray, the military veteran, on YouTube, and there's some really, really cool videos of him working with Ray, working through some of the trauma responses, and it can be very, very nuanced. Like it's really fascinating to watch Peter work with Ray, because it's these very tiny little titrations of, you know, watching how Ray managed his responses, watching how he would clench, watching how, you know, what he thought was a Tourette's type thing, because he was diagnosed with Tourette's and
Mm.
PTSD and a whole bunch of things as a result of his occupational stress injury on deployment. And it turns out it wasn't Tourette's, it was actually an incomplete trauma response from an explosion that had happened when he was in Afghanistan. And so it's really fascinating to watch. You know, it's like, oh, like, let's see, like, I noticed as you were saying that you clenched your jaw. Like, I wonder what happens, like, if we notice that next time, like, if you soften that a little bit and didn't clench
Hmm.
all the way, what starts to show up. And then we work with, you know, what starts to show up as we do less of the thing that the person's doing to manage it, you know, because it's exhausting to keep using your energy to hold your energy back or hold your energy down, as
Right.
Peter Levine likes to say, right? It's like, it's really tiring to just keep bracing and clenching and clamping and managing all the time. And
Hmm.
some people get really good at doing that because that's what was required. You know, they had to manage in all those ways in order to get by, and it gets to a point where that's really exhausting. But the alternative, which is, well, if I don't manage, then what shows up? That's terrifying too. And that's why we have to go slow.
Right. I
Mhm.
think that was a really good video. The one with the Marine.
Yeah.
Uh, what was it? He got hit by an IED. I was
Yeah.
like, that's it's only 27 minutes. I'll add that to
Yeah.
the show notes because I think it was a pretty neat process to watch how he just slowly worked through all that.
Yeah.
On
Yeah.
that, I was going to see, have you noticed any sort of qualifier that resulted in like these type of individuals or like this like approach to SE made it more beneficial? Like certain people saw results if they did this, or certain types of people saw result. You know what I mean? Like there's a spectrum of everything.
Mhm.
So like the individuals that got more out of SC, like was there anything relatable or between those, or is it just hit miss?
That's tough because, as I had mentioned at the start of the interview, I'm trained in a
Hmm.
lot of different methods for trauma recovery. And so
Right.
when I work with someone, I mean, sometimes I'll work with someone in like a purist SE perspective where I'm doing strictly that, or I'm working in a session with a client and we're using a mixture of approaches. And
Right.
in a particular session, like one session, it might be that it's very much an SE session, and that's strictly what we did that for 2 or 3 appointments in a row was just SE.
Hmm.
But then I'm usually also combining it with other things. So I also am trained in various forms of parts work, and working with parts of the personality, which often
Hmm.
accompanies. Well, I mean, everyone has parts to their personality. You can have parts and not have a dissociative disorder, and you can have parts and have a dissociative disorder. And
Hmm.
ultimately, the way of working with it is similar, although there are some distinctions. But I'll be doing parts work with folks along with SE, or I might be combining SE with EMDR, or SE with brain spotting, or SE with deep brain reorienting, or SE with equine assisted psychotherapy, for instance. So for me, it's hard for me to answer your question around who benefits best from SE, because often in my own practice, it ends up being a mix depending on what the need arising in the moment is and what best serves
Hmm.
that need, as opposed to, well, this would be best for this. I think it depends on the nervous system. And so, so sometimes I will be working strictly SE, or I'll be doing some parts work, and it becomes very evident with the parts work that there's a part of the personality that didn't get to work through a fight response. Like maybe the 7-year-old part of the personality had a lot of anger and it was afraid to voice that. And so we need to work with that anger response from the perspective of the parts. And so then how
Mm-hmm.
are we working with, like, the SE response, um, um, the SE response in relation to like the parts of the personality that got fragmented, for instance. So it's tricky for me to answer that question. I usually say, when I meet with someone, I go, hey, I want to get to know you. I want to get to know your nervous system. And even if I'm not doing a lot of outright SE still informs what I'm doing in terms of titration or in terms of
Mm-hmm.
watching for sequences. Like I have some clients who are like, I really want to do EMDR, and they love it and they get a lot out of it. And that's their preferred way of going. And sometimes as we're doing EMDR, um, it's very, very obvious that there's a body response moving through. And so the questions, or what we call interweaves in EMDR, I'll do somatic experiencing interweaves in EMDR to support what's going on as part of the body response that moves through. But the
Mm-hmm.
client, they like the structure of EMDR, and that helps them contain the experience within which we do a little bit of SE tracking, for instance. So it depends on, I would say, the person. And so the more methods you have in your toolkit, the better, because then you can shape to the organism that you've got that you're working with, as opposed to how do I make this one client fit the one
Right.
that I have, right?
No, I think you answered it perfectly. It'd be like going to the doctor and be like, I have cancer. And they're like, okay, let's put this cast on your foot. And you're like, that
Totally.
doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
No,
And SE is a nervous system thing, and we all have a nervous system. I would say SE has something to inform work with just about anybody, because we
mhm,
all have a nervous system, right? But the degree to which the SE might be used or implemented will depend on what else that person is coming in with, or what they're preferring, or where they want to start from. Because somebody ultimately still has choice, right? Individuals
right.
still have choice about what they want to do and what they're coming for and what they're asking for. So if somebody is saying, hey, I want to do SE, but then they change their minds and go, hey, I want to actually focus on this other thing, can we switch a little bit and do this other bit of work? SE is still informing my understanding of watching for their thresholds of tolerance, for instance.
Hmm.
Right. So like I'm still using an SE lens, even if I'm using a different approach. So sorry, I interrupted you there. You were about
No,
to say,
not at all. You didn't
yeah.
interrupt. It was
Okay.
natural as could be. The
Yeah.
next question, I think, will be one of the last, is going to be, if I'm looking for someone who does SE,
Mhm.
where would I go? And
Um,
what are some like qualifiers that I'd look for to be like, okay, this person, because I feel like sometimes, I guess what I really want to ask is, I don't know what a bad SE experience is. What are some signs that maybe what I'm doing is a bad SE experience, so that maybe I could go find another, you know, I just keep thinking of therapy. Like I've been in certain therapeutic sessions, and or I've had people on, and they're like, this guy or girl just, it seemed like what they were doing wasn't right.
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think so. I'll answer broadly first and then I'll narrow it down. So it's, for me, it's less about the approach than the person applying the approach and where they're at with it, right?
Hmm.
And so there's always good to be had from anything, and there's going to be folks who are maybe still growing. I mean, we've all been there. We've all been
Right.
at points where we're still learning a method, right?
Hmm.
And so, and as you're learning a method, you're not going to necessarily be skilled with it right away. It might take a while. Some people get skilled at methods quickly, and some people it takes longer. And that's
Hmm.
not nothing to be ashamed about. That's just how it goes. We all have different learning curves, right? And so it's it's tough to say. I would say, if you go to an SE session and you're feeling really overwhelmed, it might not be titrated enough,
Hmm.
right? And so that is, a common thing that can happen, is it titrated enough? And that would be something to be curious about, is like, oh, if I go to SE and I'm always overwhelmed and it doesn't seem to resolve, and I'm not saying like the first few sessions, because that sometimes can happen where you're trying to learn, the thresholds of the organism that's across from you. And especially if that person tends to live overwhelmed all the time anyway, it
Mm-hmm.
may not be that the SC is overwhelming. It could just be that they're chronically overwhelmed already in general.
Right.
And as they start to learn how to pay attention, they might start to realize, oh my gosh, I'm chronically overwhelmed. In which
Mm-hmm.
case, it's not the SC that's the problem. It's them starting to learn their own pattern, right? And so that can be a bit tricky. But let's say you go to an SE person and you find that um, they're not titrating it small enough for your nervous system, or
Mm-hmm.
they're I heard an example once about how someone had been told, oh well, you're too dysregulated, or come back when you've got this figured out. And I was like, wow, that might say more about that therapist or that provider's nervous system,
Mm-hmm.
than the method itself. So I would say, if you feel like there's something uncomfortable, or the person is misreading or misattuning, that could be a relational dynamic issue, in which case, see if it can get resolved. And if it is not resolvable, either because it's just not the right fit, sometimes within a few sessions, if something feels like the right fit or not. If it doesn't feel like the right fit, then that might be the time to kind of see if there's someone else, and
Mm-hmm.
not just go, well, the method doesn't work for me,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's easy to go, well, this failed, or this method is stupid, or and make a judgment based on what's the word, like a misinterpretation that, oh, because it didn't work with this person, therefore the method is flawed, right?
Right.
And so I would say, if you feel like you're uncomfortable, or it doesn't feel like a good match personality wise, that's fair. I mean, not every helper is going to be a good fit for every human. And so you want to make sure that you're feeling relatively comfortable enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
It might not be perfect, because maybe your trauma is a relational trauma. And so it's hard for you to feel comfortable with anybody, right? And so wanting to bear that in mind as well, you know.
Awesome.
Yeah. And then in terms of locating folks, I would say, it would be helpful to check out the SE directory. So if you go to, I think it's traumahealing.org,
Mm-hmm.
and then when you go to their website for Somatic Experiencing International, they have a really fantastic practitioner directory. Currently, it does not have a keyword search. So if you're looking for someone who speaks a particular language, or if you're looking for someone who is in a particular cultural community or has a particular focus, it's kind of tough to locate that right now,
Mm-hmm.
because the only search features, when they updated the directory, they did a huge overhaul in the last year or so, and the new directory doesn't currently have the keyword search built in, but you can certainly do a search based on geographic location, and then see who's available locally. You can do SE online. It doesn't have to be done in person. So technically, you could work with anybody anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it depends on what your scope of practice is, or that you're wanting. So if you're wanting to do body work, you're wanting to find, say, a physiotherapist who's trained in SE, or you want a massage therapist who's trained in SE, or you want a life coach who's trained in SE, or you want a licensed professional counselor who's trained in SE, you can find different scopes of practice, who are doing SE, and they'll all do SE slightly differently depending on what it is that you're looking for. Because if you're wanting physiotherapy from an SE perspective, then that would be really helpful. I could see that being really useful. And that would look different in practice than, say, someone who's a psychotherapist who's doing SE, right? So it depends on what it is that you're wanting, first off,
Mm-hmm.
and then finding ideally that person who can offer the SE from within that scope.
Awesome. I
Mm.
love it. Last question. I don't know if I'll add this into the episode or not. It's more just curiosity.
Yeah.
But the new kid on the block is psychedelics, and I'm
Yeah.
seeing it get applied to immersion therapy, couples therapy. Like it's getting, you know, EMDR and
Yeah.
was it MDMA? So it's
Yeah.
like it's getting applied to a lot of this. Is there any studies or anything going on with somatic experiencing or any of that with MDMA or any sort of psychedelics?
So SE is still, we're still getting research done on it. So
Mm-hmm.
Peter Levine spent most of the decades previously on perfecting the method and developing the method clinically. And it's
Mm-hmm.
so in the last 10, 15 years, I would say there's been more and more research about it, which has been great. And the research is very promising and very positive. That's not surprising to me. So, but what I mean by this is that there isn't a lot of specialty research yet, like,
Right.
oh, SC and psychedelics. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any studies on that yet, right? But what I
Yeah.
can say is from an SC perspective within the SC trauma community, one of the things we will say is that there is so sometimes what happens is that folks will go off to do like a healing experience, like they'll go do ayahuasca somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they'll go off to some retreat. And I've certainly had clients who've done this where they've gone to these ayahuasca retreats, and these retreats may or may not have a professional counselor there. And that professional
Mm-hmm.
counselor may or may not be body oriented. They may have CBT, they may have something or other. Um, and but there's minimal, like, I mean, I've had a number of clients who've done some of these retreats and have shared with me how it went. And I'm like, I'm really surprised at the lack of containment. So
Mm-hmm.
it's buyer beware at this point. Like, I think people
Right.
are trying to figure out how to run these things. And so what can happen, this isn't true for everybody, is you go to a retreat like this, and it might be a little over threshold for some folks. It might be, especially if they're not ready and they're like, man, I really want to, I've heard really good things about this, and this can be really powerful. This can be very, very powerful and helpful
Mm-hmm.
work, and for some people, they may not quite be ready for it yet.
Right.
And so sometimes what can be helpful is maybe going to something like SE ahead of time to help grow the capacity in the nervous system to be able to be present to what might show up
Mm-hmm.
during use of these kinds of medications, medicines,
Right.
psychedelics, etc. Because for some people it might be totally fine, no problems, and for
Mm-hmm.
other folks it might result in something coming up that they weren't ready for, and it might be really overwhelming really quickly.
Or
Um,
re-traumatize. Yeah.
Re-traumatizing. And
Mm-hmm.
especially if there's a lack of support, like what I have heard from a few people who've gone to a few of these places, I'm not saying this is true of all of them, but again, it's a
Mm-hmm.
buyer beware, do your research. Is they had a big experience, and there wasn't the containment support or the support with the body response, like that wasn't there. And after the fact, and so they were kind of left to figure it out on their own, and it was and that in and of itself can be a trauma reenactment where I had
Mm-hmm.
this experience and there was no one there, or I was left by myself, or it's kind of like going to a silent meditation retreat for 10 days and being in absolute abject silence, and there's no one there to help you, and you're not supposed to talk to anybody, and you have a big thing show up in your awareness from a trauma response that you hadn't been aware of, and then there's no one to turn to, and then you're alone in your experience, and then that's like a reenactment of a past experience, and then we're left high and dry.
Right.
And so there's a place, so within the SE community, certainly there's been conversation around how do we like support clients in terms of growing their capacity so that they're in a place where they've got some of that nervous system skillfulness,
Mm-hmm.
some of that somatic experience with their own body response, so that if something were to emerge in the midst of an experience like going to using sort of things like that, that they're okay, they're ready for it
Right.
you know and I'm not
Cool.
saying like smaller psychedelics, like sort of microdosing, like even microdosing is titration, right? So
Right.
microdosing I'm not trained in this area, so obviously qualify this by checking it out with somebody who is, but my
Mm-hmm.
understanding is that the whole point of microdosing is to titrate, and do small amounts to see what the nervous system or the body responses or the emotional responses to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it's one of those things, right? Go and learn more if you're interested in that. There are certainly a lot of research studies where you can actually be part of university research studies on this.
Yeah, I was about to
If
say
you're
that
interested.
that's
Yeah.
what I've seen that kind of stands out as like the most ideal situation is join one of the clinical trials put on by the MAPS That's the best way. They have like two therapists. You're hooked up to medical. There's a screening process, so it's like that in my mind would be the most ideal, but it doesn't appear to be on the books to be legalized until like 2024. So the
It's
only
a
way,
ways out. Yeah, it's a
yeah,
ways out. And there are people offering it, but you kind of have to go overseas. And it's this really
yeah,
taboo thing. I mean, people are doing it, it's out there. And some people are getting really fantastic results and are finding
hmm,
it to be very life changing in
yeah,
a really positive way. So I'm not here to say do it or don't do it,
right,
right? I'm just sort of saying, hey, if you're going to be curious about that, do your research, find out what is or isn't legal
hmm.
or how you go about, looking into that information.
Don't get in
Um,
trouble.
don't get right. Like, and at the same time, like, this is what's sad, right? Is that some of these medicines have been used by indigenous peoples for millennia, right?
Right, yeah,
And then we have like Western society making these medicines illegal when they haven't been. They've actually been really helpful in terms of healing mechanisms for people since the dawn of time. And that's what's unfortunate about this,
hmm,
is that that's a bigger conversation about, the decolonization of trauma and trauma recovery and what does that look like. But we do unfortunately have to live in the society that we're in, which means that there are rules and laws. And so, if you are looking into this, obviously there are people out there who are trained in
hmm,
understanding psychedelic informed psychotherapy, for instance. That's a thing. There are people
yep,
who have trained in that. There are trainings in that. There are people who are very familiar with this as an area. um, there are people who are having to be very careful about this because of laws and wanting to abide by rules and laws. And so there is information. What can be helpful, like you said, is get involved in a clinical trial. And if you're going to be exploring that, it can also be helpful to kind of check out someone who does some SE as a way of helping prepare the nervous system
hmm,
ahead of time, in terms of growing capacity, for both being in the contraction of an experience, but also the expansiveness of an experience. And that can be really important work. So that's another one of those buyer beware and yet could be very helpful things, you know.
I feel like that's with everything, like before you jump in 2 feet in, just it's always good to read up on it and just kind of get familiar with what you're about to get involved in.
That's right. That's right. And so there's a lot of really cool ways to learn more about SE. And there's a
Hmm.
lot of really great videos on YouTube. And there's some really great books written by Peter Levine. He's got some really fantastic reads out there if you want to learn more about this. And the SE Institute has a really great practitioner directory. And you can start looking through it and seeing if there's someone who is out there who might be able to offer that. And also, some people are trained in more than just SE who combine SE with other things, and that can also be really cool. So it's a really, really versatile approach. And I find one that really has transformed my practice. Even when I'm not doing SE deliberately with a client, it still informs everything I'm tracking for and everything that I'm doing. So it's really powerful work.
Awesome. I really appreciate your time. Is there anything you want to touch on before we wrap this up? I that's all my questions. I can't think of anything. Is there anything about SC that we didn't touch on that you think might be important to know?
Oh, let me think about that. And if we do a follow up, then we'll do a follow up about that.
Awesome.
Cool.
Sounds good. Well, I really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great day with your dogs and all the deer.
Thanks, Jonathan. Take good care.
And with that, we're going to wrap things up. If you have any questions that I could answer, just shoot me a DM on any of the social media platforms that are linked on my website. Or if you want to shoot Sarah some questions herself, all of her links are provided in the show notes. And with that, we're going to wrap up. Hope you all have a good one.